And a very good afternoon to you all. My name is Andrew Petersen from the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. And welcome to this second of webinars on the issues, progress and outcomes from the 25th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, brought to us by the Presidency of Chile and Spain. Now, in beginning, we acknowledge that this webinar is being produced on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And we welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us in this webinar this afternoon. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are recording this particular webinar, and following this webinar, we will be then posting a copy of the recording to the registrants for those who have and may not have been able to attend. And we'll be also posting it to our YouTube page. So if you ever wish to go back and access the information, both video and audio, you're able to do so. During the course of the webinar, we will be having Q&A. And the way that you will, as an attendee, will be able to engage in that will be through the chat function. So feel free to use that by clicking on the More button, and then you'll be able to see chat, and then feel free to send me your question at the appropriate time. So before we do, and because there is no such thing as a free webinar, what I'd like to do is just give you a brief outline as to who we are. So the Business Council for Sustainable Development is a membership-based organisation with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And with that, our motto or our creed, our purpose is the business leadership for a sustainable future. The WBCSD is a representation of 200 global companies that are united around a common vision of creating a world in which over 9 billion people are living well and within the boundaries of the planet by no later than 2050. This next slide is just a brief snapshot of those global members, of whom some are also members of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. But we are also part of a long-standing collaboration as an implementation partner of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And with that, we are joined with our 67 odd other business and non-government organisations around the world as part of the WBCSD network that encompass about 5,000 companies. BCSD Australia itself represents about 65 members, and our chair is Dr. John Hewson from the Australian National University. In terms of approach, the WBCSD realises its activity on behalf of the members through the Sustainable Development Goals by championing 6 work programs to achieve a systems transformation. Circular economy, cities and mobility, food and nature, people, redefining value, which is a cross-cutting program, and of course the one we're looking at today, which is climate and energy. And in that regard, the solutions that we are looking to support our members to deliver are those under the banner of climate and energy. And in that case, today we're looking specifically at climate action and policy and the work of the WBCSD in collaboration with other business organisations during the course of the COP over the last 12 days. Now, let's move to the delegation itself. And the WBCSD, and for that matter, the Business Council for Sustainable Development, have been long-standing observers to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for a number of years. And as registered observers, we are able to nominate and then organise for member organisations or individuals from member organisations to attend the climate conference, and for that matter, also the biodiversity conference. But in this particular case, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was held in Madrid, hosted 4 delegates from the BCSD Australia, being Michael Barbara from New Forests, Peter Holt from Energetics, Mary Stewart also from Energetics, and Matthew Warnken from AgriProve. In undertaking this particular delegation, we also partner with a number of global non-government organisations in the business space, namely the International Chamber of Commerce, which is the focal point for business and industry at the United Nations Conference, the WBCSD, which is the focal point for the Marrakesh Climate Action Partnership, and then We Mean Business Coalition, which is a broad-based coalition of a number of organisations, including the WBCSD, the Climate Group, CDP, Ceres, and BSR from America, who are also part of the collaboration that is undertaken by business during the course of the conference. Let's move then to the conference itself and what actually happened. What we'll do is a brief overview by myself, and then we'll open it for discussion from our participants who were at the COP as we move through. So this was an unusual COP for a number of reasons. The first being that it was actually to be held in Santiago, Chile, but 2 months out from the date of the COP, it actually had to be moved. And this goes to a broader narrative around the challenge that climate change poses for nation states at the moment in relation to solutions and actions and pathway for major economies. In this particular case, Chile was wrought with quite substantial protests and demonstrations in the months leading up to the COP. And 2 months out from it, the president of Chile announced that both the COP itself and also the APEC conference were to be postponed, or in fact cancelled, being held in Chile. Fortunately, the Spanish government stepped in almost immediately and offered to hold the COP. And so it's in one sense remarkable that the COP actually occurred, because you can imagine trying to organise 29,000 people at a conference or at an event and only having 2 months in which to prepare for it. In terms of the focus, what is quite stark these days is that the focus of the negotiations is as much about the observers to the United Nations conference as it is about the engagement by parties being the nation states or countries that represent the convention parties. And the graph on the screen shows that there has been a remarkable increase in the number of people that have been attending the conferences over the years, and in particular since the Paris Agreement of 2015. So whereas there was in the past somewhere in the order of 13,000 on average attending the conferences, certainly since the Copenhagen conference in COP15, now at Paris, we saw, since Paris in particular, we saw a huge uptake in the number of people attending, almost 100%. And this particular COP was no different. 25,000 registered and ultimately 29,000 plus actually attended. And so the focus and the identification of the issues that were being held at the COP were obviously not just those of nation states or countries, but also other observers, both civil society, NGOs, trade unions, farmers, and of course business. In terms of who was there, though, as parties, one of the big observations that was being looked upon during this COP was that and the role of the United States of America. We're all aware that the president has indicated a year ago now that they would be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, and that withdrawal would take effect effectively from the day before, or the day of, rather, the COP in 2020, if there were to be no other changes. For example, a change in the presidency as a result of next year's presidential election. But there were also a number of other parties. There are 197 to it, and the observations that a number of us were interested in was understanding the interrelationship not just between the major emitters, being China, the US and the EU, but also the other parties such as small island states, Africa, for example, which had a major representation in delegation this year at this particular COP, and other countries such as Australia and Japan, Saudi Arabia, particularly after the IPO of the Saudi Aramco oil company. There were a lot of different narratives that were starting to emerge that would have a profound impact upon the issues that were going to be held at this particular COP. And of course, the reason why we're all there, being the issue of the science, was quite forefront at this particular COP. But as we will hear, the science itself hasn't yet necessarily been documented as critical to and underpinning of the decisions that are made at the COP. And one of the key regrets, you might say, is that the science has not yet been welcomed or adopted by the convention framework itself. And therefore, the challenge about how parties, and for that matter, observers, are supposed to take into account and reference the science when it's not yet been accepted by the parties themselves is one of those potentially unique challenges. Now, what we were hoping to do was to actually have two of the delegates give you some insights, some initial insights into their visitation to the COP. But I notice at the moment that they're not necessarily available to us. So what we might do is move on, and we'll come back to them when they log on to the webinar. And in that regard, let us move to key questions that obviously you as business people are interested in understanding as to the process and the ultimate outcome of the COP itself. And those we've picked are as, what was the role of Australia? What were the issues that were being dealt with? What in particular was the challenge around Article 6 and why wasn't there a deal done? And what does this all mean for Glasgow and the COP26 that will be held at roughly this time next year in the United Kingdom? So what I might do is now open up the opportunity for two of our speakers, which is Peter Holt and Matthew Warnken, to actually give us some insights into some of the issues in particular that they were tracking, why they were tracking them, and some of the observations that they make in relation to the results that came from that. So Peter and Matthew, I think well, Peter's definitely unmuted, so we'll go with you first, Peter. Give us an understanding as to the why you were there, what you were tracking, and in particular the issues that you felt were relevant for business to understand going forward.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm actually sitting here with Dr. Mary Stewart, who is here in Madrid. The first
we'll come back to her.
Ask her to chime in at any time as well. So energetics overall was present at this COP because we saw it as one of the key defining moments since the Paris Agreement, moving into the Paris period, to be frank. We had an expectation coming into the meeting that we would get some agreement on the Paris rule book, particularly around Article 6, which is the carbon mechanism, trading mechanism for both market and non-market instruments as well. Now, that was our key interest. And alongside of that, that creates a whole lot of business opportunities for our global and international and local businesses who are interested in what's happening in future carbon markets, how are the trading partners responding, and what's happening around globally. So as much as the formal proceedings were of interest, so were the direct side events and business response in that context as well. Mary, do you have to add?
I mean, one of the reasons that we go is to demonstrate to the Australian government that Australian business is serious about this. Unfortunately, the Australian government was probably on the wrong side of history at this COP, in that they are one of the four parties that is responsible for Article 6 not reaching a resolution into the wee hours of Saturday night, Madrid time. So it was from the point of view of getting an outcome, it was a disappointing COP. From the point of view of the Australian government's position that went into Madrid, it was a disappointing COP. But from the point of view of seeing some ambition and understanding that the private sector is going to take significant moves in the next 12 months, it was satisfying. It will be interesting to see what happens at COP26, given that it's hosted in Glasgow. Boris Johnson had a very climate message as part of what he got re-elected on. So I am expecting a much stronger voice from a Conservative government presidency of COP26, and hopefully a real challenge to countries like Australia to actually get on board and take real action.
Yeah, so I think what was quite clear through the week, Australian negotiators usually have the ability to curtail to political outcomes as well as progress the agenda forward. What we saw in this COP was the Australian delegation very much curtailed by their mandate from the Australian government. That was becoming quite problematic, and you could see that through the various briefings that the Australians were providing to the delegates through the bingo briefings, as well as through umbrella group briefings. So Australia is also the chair of the umbrella group, which is a group of companies including Norway, Canada, Australia, the US, Russia, New Zealand, and Japan. And quite a powerful kind of negotiation block when they choose to. So Australia had a couple of key issues. One, which I think everyone in Australia in this space has been reading about, which is the Kyoto carryover credits. And that was really quite a flag to a red ball to a lot of other negotiating parties. They just didn't see it necessary or useful or in the spirit of the overall negotiations. Australia was actually quite progressive on some issues, particularly around human rights and transparency issues as well. Yet at the same time, though, we seem to be in that group of four that Mary alluded to, which was the States, Brazil, Saudi Arabia and Australia, which ultimately led to the Article 6, 6.2 and 6.4 and 6.8 not progressing any further. So we're really in this fractious state at the moment where you've got some parts of the global community, and on the other side we saw the EU Green Deal come through unanimously, with the exception of Poland from memory, supported, which then creates a very, very different global dynamic and trading partners. And one of the most tangible things coming out for Australia is that they're now looking like the introduction of some kind of import duty tax to jurisdictions that don't have any carbon penalty to protect any unfair foreign non-EU EU businesses. And that will come into effect quite shortly in 2021. So we're seeing a much more fractious global economy develop, not only on what we're seeing from the political arena, but also now in terms of playing out into tangible outcomes into business impacts as well. So a non-ideal solution, a very, very tired president by the end of the COP as well, who was quite frustrated by the lack of adoption of key criteria coming through as well. And one of the other issues that we saw quite clearly was the science. And scientists in this COP were quite clear and unanimous in their messaging that we needed to act and act quickly. We still had time to act. This is the blue COP, so it's a focus on oceans and the cryosphere, which is basically everything frozen from glaciers to snowflakes to ice sheets. Looking at the adaptive capacity of oceans, very much we're recognising that we've actually hit limitations around oceans' adaptive capacity. And oceans have adapted to global warming. They've been a big carbon sink as well, absorbing carbon, but at the same time now they're reaching limits. So that has more catastrophic impacts than for extreme sea levels for Australia, as well as rising sea levels on average. Probably more pronounced in the Northern Hemisphere, but still, nevertheless, we will experience these impacts in the Southern Hemisphere as well. And that then turns to land. When we have a lot of adaptive capacity in the land, we know that there's some areas that won't be viable in the future, from extreme heat and chronic rainfall decrease, so it won't be viable from an agricultural point of view, and alternative mechanisms will be needed to look at. And this is where, particularly in Australia, a lot of the carbon farming initiatives are critically important, and hence really then Article 6 to provide a revenue stream for those types of activities.
Thanks, Peter. Why don't we just pause there? And what we might do is, because I found Michael Barbara from New Forests, welcome Michael into the conversation when my cursor allows me to do so. No, Michael, it said promote to panelists. Let's see if that works. Okay. No, no, there we go. And Michael, can you hear us? You might need to open your microphone. Are you there?
Andrew, can you hear me?
There we go. Hello and welcome back, by the way.
Hi, thank you.
So,
sorry, I was here. I was just sitting in the background, but yeah.
We're indeed. So, Michael, I think you were, if I'm not mistaken, a COP first timer. What was your impression about the COP, both as a process, but also in terms of what you went to focus on and what issues were relevant to New Forests and New Forests customers?
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks also to BCSDA for allowing myself on behalf of New Forest to participate, and also to the other delegates. There was a fantastic atmosphere, and the ability to connect with everyone there was a fantastic experience. So for the people who don't know, New Forest is a leading investment management business investing in the forestry sector, and really we're the second largest trader of carbon into the Californian carbon market. And as someone who manages large forestry estates, we believe that the forest sector and forestry assets have a significant role to play in the mitigation of climate change. And as a business, we are actively developing new investment strategies to operate in these markets. So clearly, an outcome on Article 6 was very important for us and very front of mind in attending. However, despite Article 6 not getting to a point of agreement as we wished entering into this meeting, into this COP, I am very confident that outside of the Paris Agreement, we are seeing significant momentum in carbon markets and the role of nature in being part of the solution. So I guess taking a step back though, and as a first timer at COP, I must say I was blown away by the experience. There was over 26,000 people there across the 2 weeks. And despite it being moved at the last minute, the event itself was very well organized. Everything from getting through security and into the venue through to the operation of the venue itself. There was a diverse representation of business, industry, NGOs, government, and civil society. And you were able to engage with people very actively. I attended for 5 days, and across the 5 days, you regularly saw people. And so even if you didn't talk to them the first time, generally found an opportunity to strike up a conversation. And so as an environment for discussing business and for discussing these issues, I found it to be incredibly helpful. Each morning at 9 a.m. there was a briefing which covered the events of the day before for business. Again, very useful and a great way to start the day. There was a huge number of side events and speeches and other organised events occurring throughout the day. So I was arriving at 8:30 and the earliest I left was 6:30, and I did that for 5 days without twiddling my thumbs or needing to find something to do, apart from the odd email, of course. So yeah, I think in terms of an event, I would encourage anyone who gets the opportunity to attend. It's a great way to understand what is occurring in the market, and I look forward to getting to Glasgow in 2020.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, well, book your Airbnb now. That's all I can say. It's going to be popular. Now, Matthew, would you like to unmute yourself? Excellent.
Yes, Andrew.
Now, as a fellow old-timer,
I'm not sure that you can hear me, and I'm having some problems with it.
You are a little patchy, but can you hear me?
I can.
All right. Well, what we'll do is I will just wind you up and let you go. As a fellow old-timer to the COP process, why were you there this time? What was your observation, particularly around the work program on agriculture? And what are you taking away as positive signals, if any, that came from this particular COP?
Well, thanks, Andrew. So really the reason for my attendance at the COP was looking for opportunities on the business side of climate, especially as we, as AgriProve, are in the business of developing carbon offsets projects. We're a spin-off company from corporate carbon, very active in the Australian land transport. Any opportunities to actually create carbon credits. So a great opportunity to get an international perspective as to what other carbon projects, and also just to get a sense check in terms.
We may have lost him, which is unfortunate. So what we'll do is wait for him to dial back in. Mary, can I go back to you? And the conversation that you were most definitely tweeting about was around adaptation. So it's often referred to as the poor cousin in relation to the negotiations. Why were you so interested in it this time? And what was your focus, and what did you think came out of these negotiations? Because in fact, there was some development on that front.
So I'm an observer both to the Standing Committee on Finance and to the technical examination process on adaptation. So I have a clear understanding of where the UNFCCC feels money needs to be spent, and it's a 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation. We see a lot of effort going into mitigation, and the carbon market is all about monetary flows to support mitigation efforts. But there's very little indication of where the money is going to come from for adaptation and how that is going to progress going forward. So while we did have a 15-year interim stocktake on a position on adaptation, it is clear that both the private and the public sector are not spending adequately in this area, and increasingly countries and companies are unprepared for the temperature and climate changes that are coming in the near term. And we do need to recognise in Australia it will happen in the next 10 years. So not only do we have a significant emissions reduction effort ahead of us, we also have the need to adapt to a changed environment.
Sorry for that. I wasn't quite ready for you to finish.
You're quite surprised when I only speak for 3 minutes.
I know, particularly with the tweets. So with that, then the challenge around this particular COP was about 2 points, that being ambition and that being finalising the rule book in relation to markets. And yet we have this ongoing iterative process that occurs now, obviously, up to 25 of these meetings. And given that you've now all been at least to one, if not few, do you feel that the process is worthy of continuation? Because that was one of the questions that was being asked. What's the legacy of this process, and what's going to happen after the Paris Agreement, fingers crossed, comes into effect next year? What was your take on whether or not there was a strength of purpose in relation to the process going forward?
I think the most extraordinary session I've ever sat in at a COP was, I think, the 16th session looking at the review of the CDM. And this extraordinary group of unbelievably talented negotiators fighting about the same point for the 8th year in a row, and recognizing that these people are going to carry on doing it until it's finished. So for me, the value of the COP and the value of multilateral processes is that while you get an agreement that is a lowest common denominator, because it's an agreement between now 197 different parties to every single word that's in it, it is an agreement. And until we have a very clear pathway forward to how we're going to decarbonize globally, we have to carry on having these discussions. So from my perspective, the COP needs to carry on. We have to carry on having these discussions. We've got to have a place for the disagreements to be had and for the agreements to be made until globally we have a clear pathway to carbon neutrality, and even more importantly, a clear pathway to how we're going to deliver 7.6% emissions reductions year on year for the next 10 years. And it's a very complicated thing to try and do. So as a minimum, the COP needs to be around to make sure that we're having the review processes and we're holding countries to account with respect to their commitments.
Thanks for that. Yeah, good observations. Fortunately, we've got Matthew back online, and I think Michael would like to make a point first. Matthew?
Andrew, is that better?
That's a lot better. That's wonderful.
Yeah, so apologies for that patchiness, and then I missed some of the discussion, but maybe just coming back to your opening questions in terms of why I was attending, and that was really looking at the business opportunities. AgriProve is a spin-off company from Corporate Carbon, which is very active in the Australian Emissions Reduction Fund space, with a focus on land sector projects, or to use the vernacular now of COP25, natural climate solutions. So the main purpose of being over there was looking for those, I guess, perspectives as to how carbon project opportunities were unfolding with other, in other jurisdictions, conversing with other carbon project developers and seeing how that commercial case played out. And I think the commercial aspect was very much one of the silver linings for COP. I mean, though, you know, the discussion has played out, those multilaterals are very much a political beast, but the side events, and in particular how the commercial case, I think, attracted a lot of attention. And it was actually Peter Backer from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in setting out the business climate plan and identifying a real convergence around the 1.5 degrees Celsius, so business accepting the science-based target, a focus on just transition, so building jobs in the new economy in terms of transitioning workers into those new pockets in a decarbonised economy, and then being and adopting the target of net neutral by 2050, which underlines that ambition.
Thank you for that. You're displaying the Mary Stewart behaviour of finishing a lot quicker than I thought you would. Michael, go back to you. I think you may have had some observation to make in relation to the comments Mary was making.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Not to jump around too much, but I had given the question some thought as to the process of the COP itself, and if it was the most useful vehicle for these discussions. And I guess one thought I had, and perhaps Mary can chip in here because she's much closer to this process and understands it better than I do, but what work can be done between parties leading up to the COP? So not so much of the negotiation hinges on the 2 weeks. One of the issues that I observed is that negotiators and ministers attending the COP to negotiate are effectively constrained by the mandate that they're given, which is probably decided days, if not weeks, ahead of the conference itself. And I felt like that really hamstrung the ability for parties to change their position. In my world, it would be like going into a negotiation on a transaction with a mandate from the executive of this company with no ability to change path. So just interested in Mary's thoughts on, could any more work be done leading up to the event to ensure that we drive towards outcomes quicker?
And there is a huge amount of work that goes on behind the scenes, both at secretariat level, so that's at the UNFCCC, and then within countries. There is typically a pre-COP that's held 6 months out, and then there are, within each of the mechanisms, additional places where the negotiators get to meet and to work on text that goes through to the COP. From my perspective, the one extraordinary thing that I never understood about the UNFCCC is it's really just the most enormous media machine. It's very good at getting messages through, and they work extremely hard with the parties and with the negotiators to build momentum behind the message for 9 or 12 months leading into the COP. So the Secretariat's going to take 1 or 2 months of well-deserved rest, and they will then start working on the messages to get ready for Glasgow. I don't know if that inability to change positions is the fault of the process. I think that it's the way governments approach this. The Australian government came into these negotiations with a very specific point of departure, and it would not be moved from that point. Other governments did change where they were coming from in some negotiations. So I think it's more a strong function of how the government decides it's going to approach the negotiations. Last year, the Australian negotiators didn't really have a policy point of departure. So what they worked on was getting the negotiations finished. So they had a very different point of departure in those meetings. So I don't know if it's as much a function of the COP process as opposed to how different governments choose to engage with negotiations.
Thanks.
Yeah, and we actually saw, I guess, their negotiating position many months ago when the Department of Foreign Affairs and Department of the Environment and Energy actually provided a pre-briefing to a number of industry stakeholders and NGOs around what was the expectation for particularly the Article 6 negotiations. And it's probably true to say that they felt at that point that they were quietly confident that there in fact would be a deal done. So in one sense, this has come as just as much of a surprise, although perhaps not, given that there were other parties that were highlighting actions and positions, particularly by Australia and Brazil and others, that were no-goes. And we saw, I think, in this first week, the first portent of what then eventuated, which was statements that it was better to have no deal at all rather than a bad deal. And I think the COP president was actually trying very hard to mitigate that kind of view. The observation around, Peter's observation around the influence of individual country or regions' ambition and commitment, and now that the EU has forecast this, the equivalent of the new Green Deal, I'd be interested from all four of you to understand what resonance that had when it was announced, which I think was mid-second week, because there was an expectation that not only the EU but also China would make some grand announcement in relation to new ambition, and that this would be, in one sense, what should have happened in September at the United Nations General Assembly during the climate summit, but didn't eventuate. And now we had to wait until the COP to see that eventuate. What was the I guess the vibe, to use a Castle expression, around the COP in relation to that particular ambition? And did it have any real sense of it having legitimacy, or was it just as a positioning piece by, didn't even have the sign off from Poland? So Which one of you would like to take a stab at commenting on that?
Oh, hi, Andrew. It's Peter. It was interesting that business on some levels was quite vocal, and what we saw was Paris was all around the 2-degree target. What the key messaging coming from the COP, in the Chilean COP in Madrid, was 1.5 degrees. So high ambition, 1.5 degrees. This is our new target and goal. We saw that adopted the zero net carbon by 2050 for the EU Green Deal. In Australia then, it's thinking, well, who else has done this? What else is the degree of ambition around here? And we often forget, but we shouldn't, is the role of the states. And all of the eastern seaboard states, plus South Australia and Tasmania and the ACT, all have now zero net carbon by 2050 or equivalent or more stringent targets as well. So you're looking at something in the order of 15 countries plus the EU, plus then a whole lot of states, so sub-jurisdiction entities as well. So the momentum is really gaining from both above and below. You've got Volkswagen talking about there being responsible for 1% of the world's emissions, and also looking at a zero net carbon strategies by 2050 as well. But a lot of businesses is now, particularly European businesses, ensconcing zero net carbon targets as business as usual. So the question is, what becomes compliance, particularly for European companies, and then what goes beyond compliance as well. And the interesting thing is, and I go back to a word I used before, the fractious nature, is that the Australian negotiators seem to be out of step with this theme as well. And we're experiencing this here when we get back to a very hazy Sydney day as well, with the highest pollution, airborne pollution levels that we've had for many, many years. And the lack of the ability to link climate change to increased bushfires and the ferocity of bushfires which we are experiencing. So I think we are seeing social pressure build. The other effect and impact was very present at the COP was Greta Thunberg as well. And she was the one who had the entourage around her. She had people flocking left and right and centre, no matter how old or young you were. She was the one who was really striving for accountability and for ambition as well from all actors in play. And I think we're seeing that social revolution, increasing expectations of standards coming from all quadrants of the community at the moment.
Thanks, Peter. Anybody else would like to chime in?
Yeah.
And before you do, Matthew, just to our participants in the attendees group, if you'd like to start thinking about Q&A and any particular questions that have arisen from this or anything you've read you'd like to ask us, by all means use the chat function to send the question to myself, and then I will ask the panellists. So, Matthew, over to you.
And hopefully I'll make it through one segment or at least one comment. And maybe just then to echo that about the EU Green Deal and business convergence. So net neutral by 2050 becomes now the standard that many companies are adopting and signing on to. So that business case by World Business Council for Sustainable Development, International Chamber of Commerce, amongst others. So that very much becomes the, I guess, expectation for business to sign on not only to the science, but the ambition of a net neutral 2050 program. And then for me, it's natural climate solutions, which was the other big standout. So within context of the EU Green Deal, it was about biodiversity and from farm to fork in terms of agricultural systems, and certainly being an attendee at the 4 per 1,000 workshop, which was a side event to the COP. That announcement on the EU Green Deal sort of put a spring in everyone's step on the soil carbon front in terms of opportunities to build soil carbon as a way of building resilience into agricultural systems, a way of providing mitigation with an adaptation backstop. So that regenerative agriculture value piece becoming a very important aspect of delivering on a net neutral 2050 target.
Thanks for that. Michael, I think you had an observation as well.
Obviously, New Forest, our clients are predominantly institutional investors, and I attended a couple of events with large groups of institutional investors. And again, action outside of the Paris Agreement is occurring at that level, with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of capital now actively taking action through how they invest their capital and how they position their portfolios. It's being influenced by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and things of that nature. And so even beyond the Paris Agreement, which will continue to move forward, I'm confident of that, we have a whole range of other social and corporate initiatives that will continue to see us moving in one direction, that is towards decarbonisation. And obviously the airline industry as well. We can't forget Corsia, which is expected to create demand for 2.6 billion tonnes of offsets between now and 2035. So I think the social pressures and the corporate pressures will eventually influence the political, and that is when we'll start to see more action under the Paris Agreement as well.
Thanks for that. We do have a question. Did any of you come in contact with Minister Taylor? And if so, what was your impression about Australia's position while he was there?
So I attended the CMI Australian event and had the opportunity to speak with Minister Taylor after his presentation. His speech there was very much focused on technology solutions and against nuancing Australia's approach, which is all about wanting to have solutions in place. And I guess that sort of comes back to the mandate that the Australian negotiating team had, and they were doing their best again from a nuancing perspective in terms of positioning the carryover issue as not being anti-ambition, just needing to be able to deliver on Australia's commitment. So Minister Taylor was quite upbeat in terms of the opportunities, and Australia wanting to get out on the front foot in terms of technology. He talked about hydrogen economy. He talked about the investments that Australia is making into natural climate solutions, or the emissions reduction fund, and the land sector. So he's very much talking up Australia as being taking action and being very much proactive from a technology perspective and a land sector perspective.
Thanks for that. We have another question. Which parties challenged the Australian position on Article 6 loopholes and the use of our Indigenous communities to justify Australia's relative inaction? What are the key stopping blocks for responsible investment in Australia? It's probably a second question, but not unrelated. Who would like to provide any observation on that one?
I think everyone, all other negotiating parties except for the 4 that we mentioned, challenged Australia. Norway was particularly vocal, so was New Zealand, so was Grenada, all of the EU bloc countries. I think Australia's burnt a lot of political capital through these negotiations as well, which will flow over into other trade agreements and UN conventions as well.
And it was very obvious that civil society was not happy. Australia received, I think, 5 fossils of the day across the 10 that were awarded during the COP. So very clear message from civil society that Australia was not only not doing enough, but was doing really badly.
And the key stopping blocks for, it's a sensible question. Australia's locking itself out of additional revenue streams. Now, what you'll see is probably a series of bilateral agreements between like-minded jurisdictions, which may effectively lock Australia out for some of these opportunities. Needless to say, though, that doesn't mean that sub-jurisdictions, i.e. the states in Australia, could enter into these agreements. It just means that we've got a more convoluted marketplace than what we would have liked to have developed.
Indeed. I'd like to move on to the, if I can get the slide to do it. I'd like to move on to the role of business at the COP, because both the sense I was getting back in Australia, but also from the reactions that you were making, that, and as you've just said, that the business was actually quite present. And there is both a heartening, but in one sense disturbing disconnect from the Paris Agreement, in that people are wanting to do things notwithstanding that nothing's happening on the execution under the Paris Agreement. But I think that that's all contextualised in wanting to align under the science-based targets, the ambition for climate action by the United Nations Global Compact. And then we saw a significant announcement by Repsol, for example, I think at the beginning of the first week, or maybe it was in fact the week before, where you had the 4th largest oil and gas company in the world indicating that they were going to go net zero by no later than 2030. What was your observation about business? We had a question actually on LinkedIn asking us how present were the fossil fuel companies at the COP, and were they actually paying for all the side events, to which we responded, well, no, because no individual company is allowed to be represented at these negotiations. But what was your observation and your engagement and your interaction with the business community while you were at the COP, in addition, obviously, to the 4 of you being there on behalf of BCSD Australia?
There were lots of lawyers present, so it clearly means something of value is going on.
That's disturbing.
Businesses were there, but so we had Paul Polman with a very prominent position, and his messaging were around using science-based targets, aligning for a 1.5 degree world, and then looking at the just transitions. So looking at the employability and the jobs of the future, and how to develop and build capacity within new industries as well. And he was extremely vocal and very coherent. And so was John Denton from the ICCC, so the International Council Chamber. And he was speaking of lots of large and small business chambers globally as well, talking about a strong, compelling narrative, the need for change and the just transition that must occur with those as well. But then I must say, businesses were then also stepping back, particularly within the precincts of the COP, and being quite quiet and listening, learning, observing, and will go and make their own business decisions in their own time. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development have a couple of conferences on the side, and that's where businesses were being far more vocal, from the Microsofts to the Endesas to the Enels to the Engines and the Volkswagens and IKEAs of the world, who were really talking about circular economy, waste, as well as the transition to a low carbon economy as well.
And I think it's important to note the presence of advertising by the private sector, and particularly Acciona, Engie and Enel, who had plastered Madrid with adverts around high ambition. So it was easier to see the companies that are focusing on 1.5 degrees and focusing on emissions reduction in the short term. And I think that's what I wanted to say about the new Green Deal, is not only is it carbon neutral by 2050, but it's significant emissions reductions by 2030. So they have put in place emissions reduction that are within the planning horizon of the private sector. And increasingly, we're seeing the private sector looking at those emissions reductions by 2030. It's difficult to say if the naysayers were there, because the ones that you're hearing really is the people who are looking at high ambition and looking at getting their message across.
And certainly a follow-on focus on natural climate solutions was very much present. And in terms of what can be done to achieve that net neutral by 2050 ambition. So there's a lot of support and a lot of interest. And there was multiple side events around various aspects of those natural climate solutions, be that blue carbon, be that the land sector and decarbonising, or decarbonising agriculture, whether that be the forestry piece. So there was multiple strands to that theme on natural climate solutions, and I think it's also important to give the Australian government credit in terms of some leadership that they're displaying in the blue carbon space and taking a leadership role in developing accounting systems for blue carbon projects, so that's restoring mangroves. And also for being very much having a funding mechanism through the Emissions Reduction Fund into demonstrating large-scale natural climate solutions, because they are the kind of projects that are being looked at from a commercial perspective in terms of investment opportunities for business to be able to deliver on that net neutral 2050 ambition.
Thanks for that. Let's now wrap up, and all four of you, I'd like to get from you an answer to this question. Assuming you go next year, assuming you can get there, what would you like to see, and what do you think realistically is going to be the outcome of this this particular COP? Who'd like to go first?
Happy to kick us off before my fellow delegates take all the good answers. I guess obviously an outcome on Article 6 is seen as critical for a number of reasons, but one is because a functioning, transparent, operational international market will offer the lowest cost mitigation outcome. And so I think it will remain a large focus going into Glasgow. And that's certainly what I hope to see. But again, in the absence of that, there will be plenty of other activity to keep us busy in the meantime.
All right, so Article 6, thank you, Michael. Peter and Mary.
I'd like to see an acceptance of the science and an understanding that science is an enabler that we can use to drive action and ambition forward. No longer having dismissal of science by the parties, but also seeing business behind the science, because business uses facts to take decisions, and they need the science and they need to understand it.
And I would really like to see, well in advance of Glasgow, the Australian business community, particularly from a board and leadership level, call to action to particularly the negotiators and the government for a very strong position to come to a robust outcome from both an ambition and a consensus perspective. And by that I mean demonstrating that the lack of any kind of global policy is actually forestalling Australia's future economy. So the quicker that we can come to a solution, the quicker Australia can position as leaders.
Excellent. So business leadership, acceptance of science, and Article 6. Matthew.
For me, it's going to be metrics on natural climate solutions, because there was such, I think, momentum around that and the importance of those solutions in terms of delivering a net 2050. So whether that's measurement in terms of investment or measurement by carbon offsets that have been created, but it's looking as to tracking that business investment into projects. And I guess from a AgriProve perspective, got a specific focus on regenerative agriculture, because we think regenerative is to ag what renewables is to energy. And so looking as to how those systems of agricultural and the decarbonising of ag in particular is starting to be able to track. And that sort of lines up with the Glasgow and the first reporting back session on the Coronovia joint work on agriculture section. So that's, I'll be looking for Glasgow to give a Coronovia sort of starting to map out a bit of a success story there for regenerative agriculture.
Okay, so Article 6, acceptance of science business leadership in Australia and metrics on natural climate solutions. They are our policy asks, people, for 2020. In the absence of being able to clap, I'd very much like to thank our delegation for the rich insights that they've been able to give us today. I'm hoping that they will be as interested, if not more so, in joining the delegation for 2020. And of course, if you are interested in attending, please drop us a line and contact us via the website, and we'd be more than happy to talk about how you can become involved. The last is just a quick update as to how BCSD was engaged in this and what we're going to do next. BCSD Australia was in partnership with a number of other parties under the IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, led launch of the statement on the role of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And whilst we didn't see a conclusion, it was heartening to see a number of business organisations, including ourselves, but also APIA, the Australian Industry Group, and also the Carbon Market Institute in Australia. So there was quite a large Australian contingent that was a signatory to this particular statement in the first week of the COP, really giving strength to the notion that business wanted to see robust, ambitious, but also highly credible outcomes for Article 6. And I think that that's going to stand it in good stead going into 2020. Finally, a bit of announcement. We're going to be holding our own Climate Action Summit. It's going to be held on the 11th of February in the Parliamentary Theatre of Parliament House in Canberra. It will be held during a parliamentary sitting week. And we're delighted that we're being joined in partnership with the Australian University, CDP, Women Business Coalition and the WBCSD to convene this particular summit. It's going to be unusual to this extent. We're not asking politicians to come and tell us what they think is needing to be done, and we're not going to have a room where any spokesperson is going to call for leadership from the political class. We're not that excited by what leadership, if any, they're going to provide. So rather, we're going to be talking about what action is going on, what ambition needs to be undertaken, and what the challenge of transition could mean in terms of opportunity. So if you're interested, please keep alive to our website over the next 24 to 48 hours when we post a link to the registration page, and you can become part of a year-long dialogue as to what ambition could look like under Australia's National Determined Contribution. And we will then be providing that to our colleagues in Women Business and WBCSD, and hopefully also the International Chamber of Commerce, as a business in collaboration with civil society, NGOs, academia, and subnational government in Australia going into next year's COP. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. We trust that you have found this interesting and that you will share information in relation to this webinar with your colleagues and your network. But for now, please thank all of the speakers and for you as the participants today. And it's nothing other than left to say, have a very happy and Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we look forward to seeing you in 2020 at some part of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia's engagement. Thank you very much and a very good afternoon to you all.
Thanks, everyone.